after earning his licentiate in theology from the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. Father Guilbeau spent several years doing pastoral work in New York City before beginning doctoral studies in moral theology at the University of Freiburg in Switzerland. There he completed his dissertation, Charles de Conic's Defense of the Primacy of the Common Good, which focuses on the proper interpretation of St. Thomas Aquinas' teaching. In addition to his teaching on the pontifical faculty at the Dominican House of Studies, Father Guilbeau serves as senior editor of the English edition of aletheia.org. He is also the current prior of the Priory of the Immaculate Conception, located right across the street from the Catholic University of America and the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C. Father Guilbeau speaks frequently on the common good and moral theology, especially through the Priory's apostolate, the Thomistic Institute, which specifically aims to strengthen intellectual formation of Christians at universities. I highly recommend that you check out their various offerings, especially their engaging YouTube series, Aquinas 101, podcast, Godsplaining, that is also excellent. Tonight, Father Guilbeau talks on the common good as the principle of friendship. So please join me in welcoming Father.
Thank you, Dr. Burkhardt, and thanks all of you for the invitation to be here at Benedictine. It's my first visit to the campus, and it's something, even though it's my first visit here, it's something of a homecoming. I, like you, am Benedictine trained, Benedictine taught. I attended college seminary at St. Joseph Abbey down in Louisiana, and so my first taste of philosophy and theology were fed to me by Benedictine monks. That's not something that happens too often in the modern world, but it is a blessing and a gift and a grace, and I hope that you all here as students of Benedictine appreciate that. What you have here is something very special and a gift of God and a sign of His own providence for you. And so I'm going to spend some time with the monastic community tomorrow, so I'm anxious to meet them. But all that's to say thank you. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here this evening, especially to deliver this annual Justin Martyr lecture. Maybe before I begin, just to say there was is a handout. I don't know if everybody's been able to get a copy. All right. I have several quotations in the paper, and they're more or less in chronological order. But you see on the sheet they're organized by author, so sometimes you may have to flip back a page or two. But that's just to make it easier for you listening to the longer quotations to be able to follow them right in front of you. In 1943, as the Second World War continued to rage, the Thomist philosopher Charles de Conic published a brief but fiery essay entitled On the Primacy of the Common Good Against the Personalists. In this essay, de Conic takes issue with several aspects of a new doctrine of human dignity that various personalist writers at the time were advancing. One aspect of the new doctrine that troubled de Conic particularly concerned friendship. Namely, what some personalist writers were identifying as the source of the love that binds friends. De Conic challenges the worrisome personalist innovation with classic Thomist teaching. Others are not the reason for the proper lovableness of the common good. Rather, under this formal relation, others are lovable insofar as they can participate in the common good. De Conic is speaking here specifically of the common good of the family, countering the claim by some personalist writers that the goodness and dignity of individual family members founds and causes the goodness and dignity of the family as a whole. To the contrary, de Conic argues, the good's causality runs in the other direction, not from person to thing, but from thing to person, not from family members to family, but from family to family members. In other words, it is not the goodness of individual family members that makes the family commonly good and lovable. Rather, the members of a family become lovable to each other because they enjoy, even before they converse in familial ways, a kind of communication with each other, a communicatio, within the same higher and common good, in this case, the good of the family. Contrary then to the personalist claim that friendly relations form a family, DeConnick insists that a family forms friendly relations. The common good of the family provides both the principle of and the context for the love that develops between family members and binds them together personally. The love of Homer, Marge, Bart, Lisa, and Maggie do not make them the Simpsons. Rather, their being the Simpsons make it possible for Homer, Marge, Bart, Lisa, and Maggie to love each other as relatives. Elsewhere in his essay, DeConnick makes the same point in reference to the common good of beatitude. The communication with the common good establishes the communication of individual persons among themselves, DeConnick writes. The common good, qua common good, is the root of this communication, which would not be possible were the divine good not already loved in its communicability to others. Here, DeConnick's language becomes more technical, but his purpose remains clear. He explains that to understand the conviviality, the friendship of the blessed in heaven, one must point to its source not in the saints themselves, but in the communication, the communicatio of the divine good. Because the blessed all love the same good as a good for all, then they love each other as lovers of the same good. As in the family, therefore, so too in heaven. The common good founds and causes interpersonal relations of love. Contrary then to the personalist suggestion that friendly saints form heaven, DeConnick insists that heaven forms friendly saints. The common good of beatitude provides both the principle of and the context for the love that develops between the blessed and binds them together personally. The love of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John do not make them blessed, DeConnick would say. Rather, their being among the blessed makes it possible for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John to love each other as saints. While DeConnick highlights in his essay the community-inducing character of the common good, he spends little time describing either the metaphysics or the mechanics of the common good's community building. Likewise, he assures the reader of his argument's Thomistic foundation, but he does not pinpoint the sources within St. Thomas's works. And what follows? I hope to provide these elements missing from DeConnick's presentation by placing his observations in conversation with contemporary scholarship on Aquinas' doctrine of communicatio. This scholarship confirms St. Thomas's awareness that friendship between persons requires some foundation other than the good character or the goodwill of the friends themselves. This foundation lies not within the friends, but outside of them, in a social context that unites them in some shared love or activity prior to their being bonded by friendly affection. As we shall see, appreciation of Aquinas' doctrine of communicatio allows for a deeper comprehension of DeConnick's polemic with the personalists, and why he confidently applied the classical doctrine of the primacy of the common good against the personalist doctrine of the primacy of the person. At the same time, DeConnick's defense of Aquinas' doctrine of the common good allows for a deeper reading of the contemporary scholarship on communicatio. While modern scholars have helped their readers to appreciate the role that communicatio plays in Aquinas' theory of friendship, they neglect to convey Aquinas' sense that, as the principle of friendship, communicatio has a principle of its own, the common good. As I will show, DeConnick's review of Aquinas' doctrine of the common good complements contemporary scholarship on Aquinas' doctrine of communicatio by showing how, for Aquinas, the common good, as the principle of communicatio, serves accordingly as the principle of friendship. Before we begin to examine St. Thomas's doctrine of communicatio, a brief word about DeConnick's argument against the personalists is in order. In the primacy of the common good, De Koninck reviews Aquinas' doctrine of the common good for a very specific reason: to counterpose Aquinas' teaching to a new conception of human dignity then proposed by an ascendant class of personalist writers. De Koninck judges this new theory of dignity, however well-intentioned its authors, to stray dangerously from classical orthodoxy. De Koninck observes in the personalist theory that, based on their sharp distinction between the human creature as a material individual and the human creature as a spiritual person, the personalists conceive even of a new principle of human society. They no longer believe, like St. Thomas, that this principle rests in the common good, which the personalists deem perfective only of man's lower material individuality. They locate the principle of society instead within man himself, in his generosity, which the personalists assert flows naturally from man's higher spiritual personality. Accordingly, the personalists argue that human persons, qua persons, associate with each other freely and spontaneously, not because of anything that they share, but because of their natural generosity and magnanimity. In the personalist conception of friendship, therefore, generous souls incline to generous souls. In natural societies, however, the personalist suggests that something less dignified, less personal obtains. In the family and in the city, needy bodies depend on needy bodies. Warning of the naivete of such a social theory, De Koninck points in primacy to the negative effects that such thinking could have on real societies. Though De Koninck does not identify the personalist writers whom he criticizes, one can find the anthropological and social ideas that he critiques in the writings of Emmanuel Mounier, the founder of French personalism. For example, Mounier employs the personalist, spiritual person, material individual distinction in his 1936 Personalist Manifesto. Dispersion and avarice, Mounier writes, these are the two marks of individuality. The person is marked by self-mastery and choice. He is generous. In his inner orientation, the person is turned in the exact opposite direction from the individual. Mounier theorizes here that the human being, as a material individual, discovers himself as a material object in a material world, thrown in and scattered among other material beings with whom he is ordered toward interacting materially, that is, in a disordered, impersonal, and even avaricious manner. As a spiritual person, however, the same human being possesses the vocation to self-possession and self-determination, and thus he is ordered toward engaging other persons in a spirit of generosity. For Mounier, therefore, the person-individual distinction has implications for how we should understand human social relations. While natural to human beings, life in the family and in the city has an important but limited value. Family and civic life draws the material individual into material associations with other material individuals. Over and above these material associations, spiritual associations of generosity and love become possible to human beings, not by virtue of their families or cities, which pull them downwards, but by virtue of their spiritual personalities, which push them upwards. When later in his manifesto Mounier describes his vision of a personalist society, he repeats his view that man's natural societies provide him less than a fully personal life. A personalist civilization, Mounier writes, is a civilization that orients its spirit and structures toward the fulfillment of each of its constituents as persons. This civilization recognizes the reality of natural communities and their proper finality. Here he means families and cities, which is different from the simple sum of individual interests and superior to the interest of the individual considered materially. Nevertheless, These natural communities have as their final end to empower each individual to live as a person. That is, to reach a maximum of initiative, of responsibility, and of spiritual living. In this passage, Mounier again identifies man's life in the family and in the city, or what he calls life in the zone of the social, as constituting part of man's material life. He asserts simultaneously that any material good is oriented to the person's spiritual good. Mounier leads his reader to the conclusion, therefore, that the individual's social life as something material lies beneath and is to be sublimated into the person's spiritual life. In other words, the good of one's community exists to serve the good of one's person. In Primacy, de Koninck notes how personalist descriptions of social life, like Mounier's, differ from classical conceptions of man's social flourishing. Among the differences that de Koninck notes, the most grievous is what he sees as the personalist reversal of what Aquinas understood to be the ordering of man's particular good to the common good. For Mounier, the person does not rest in his end when his family or his city flourishes. Rather, his city and his family and his city rest in their ends when the individual person flourishes. It's when he emerges from his natural communities, their good sublimated into his particular good, more a whole to himself than a part of the greater wholes of the family or the city. According to this depiction of human happiness, de Koninck warns, the common good no longer constitutes the final cause of the common good. The final cause of human flourishing. Instead, human flourishing constitutes the final cause of the common good, a reversal. In staunch opposition to this view, de Koninck cautions his readers over the consequences that personalist theory might have for real societies. Families and political communities cannot long survive, de Koninck argues, if the self replaces the common good as the goal and end of social life. Mounier was not the only high-profile personalist thinker to elevate the person's particular good over the common good in this way. In Jacques Maritain's personalist thinking also, which paralleled but did not intertwine with Mounier's, the spiritual person, material individual distinction features prominently. This is true especially in texts where Maritain applies his personalist thinking to political theory. In his 1940 work, Scholasticism in Politics, for example, Maritain introduces the question of the relation of person to society, which he calls the fundamental subject of all social and political philosophy, by outlining the distinction between the person and the individual. For Maritain, mastery of this distinction is prerequisite to any speculative treatment of man's political life. It is impossible to discuss political philosophy, Maritain writes, without first embarking upon a rather abstract philosophical consideration concerning individuality and personality, two notions which are usually confused and whose distinction I consider to be highly important. Accordingly, one finds in scholasticism and politics articulations of the person-individual distinction like the following. The human being is held between two poles, a material pole which in reality does not concern authentic personality, but rather the material condition in the shadow, as it were, of personality, and a spiritual pole which concerns personality itself. Maritain takes care not to be misunderstood on this point. He clarifies that the two poles of man's identity do not create within him two selves. There remains in man one self, but with two distinct principles of identity and action. It is the same entire being which in one sense is an individual and in another sense a person. I'm wholly an individual by reason of what I receive from matter, and I am wholly a person by reason of what I receive from Spirit. Of man's material individuality, Maritain writes, one might say that in each of us, individuality, being in one, that which excludes from one all that other men are, is the narrowness in being and the grasping for oneself, which in a body animated by spirit derives from matter. Of man's spiritual personality, Maritain paints an opposing picture. The notion of personality does not refer to matter, as does the notion of individuality applied to corporeal things. It refers to the highest and deepest dimensions of being. Personality is rooted in the spirit, insofar as the latter stands by itself in existence and superabounds in it. Maritain describes the contact of these two principles in a single human being in the following terms. Man, insofar as he is a material individuality, has but a precarious unity, which wishes only to slip back into multiplicity. For matter as such tends to decompose itself. Insofar as we are individuals, each of us is a fragment of a species, a part of this universe, a single dot in the immense network of forces and influences, cosmic, ethnic, historic, whose laws we obey. We are subject to the determinism of the physical world. But each man is also a person. He's not subject, is also a person, and insofar as he is a person, he is not subject to the stars and atoms, where he subsists entirely within the very subsistence of his spiritual soul. And the latter is in him a principle of creative unity, of independence, and of freedom. Maritain asserts in this and similar passages that as a material individual, the human creature is subject to the laws of physics, biology, history, society, and all of the other laws that govern the material universe. As a spiritual person, however, the human creature soars above the stars as an instance of creative freedom in an otherwise determined universe. Maritain's description of the polarity separating man's constitutive principles could not be starker. What concerns critics like de Koninck is the way in which personalists like Maritain set the realities of human personality apart from and above the exigencies of human individuality. The personalist comparison of the body and the soul seems always to exalt the soul to the degradation of the body. A single soul is of more worth than the whole universe of bodies and material goods, Maritain writes. There is nothing above the human soul except God. In regard to the eternal destiny of the soul and its supertemporal goods, society exists for each person and is subordinated to it. Based on his understanding of the distinction of spirit and matter in the human being, Maritain describes the mature individual as one who surrenders to the upward thrust of his spirit in defiance of the downward pull of his matter. If the development of the human being follows the direction of material individuality, Maritain writes, he will be carried in the direction of the hateful ego, whose law is to snatch, to absorb for oneself. If, on the contrary, the development follows the direction of spiritual personality, then it will be in the direction of the generous self, of saints and heroes, that man will be carried. Man will really be a person, insofar as the life of spirit and of freedom will dominate in him that of passion and the senses. As in Mounier's writings, the person-individual distinction in Maritain's works has the effect of sublimating the material good of the individual to the spiritual good of the person, which at the same time subordinates the common good of the individual to the particular good of the person. Social interaction, therefore, has a new purpose for Maritain, at least in comparison to Aquinas' thinking. Aquinas roots the social interaction of human beings in the common good. Like Mounier, however, Maritain roots the friendship of persons as distinct from the social associations of mere individuals in the native generosity of the human spirit. As the greatest thing in creation, the person has no choice finally but to love all things for the self, whose innate greatness stands as his temporal final end. Only God demands more love than the self. This is not a hindrance to friendship, however. For Maritain, the Spirit's abundance of goodness spills out in generosity and a kind of self-diffusion toward the recognition and confirmation of other persons. Thus, in personalist thinking, does the self become the principle of friendship and communion. In his criticism of the personalist doctrine of human dignity, which reverses the Thomist ordering of man's particular good to his common good, de Koninck could not be more forceful. Take note of how the self-proclaimed personalists, who put the person above the common good, could no longer detect the link that binds persons together, de Koninck writes. Consequently, they replace this link with another, a sordid fraternity that would immediately unite persons among themselves as if each individual were a common good for all the others. This amounts to making each citizen a tyrant. Aman seipsum magis quam civitatem, loving himself more than the city. According to de Koninck, the society idealized by personalist thinkers is sordid, for in it there exists no greater good for persons to love than the self. De Koninck argues that in such a sordid fraternity, or what we might call a confederacy of tyrants, there can be no friendship among persons. For each person loves the common good of the family or of the city, for example, not for itself and its shareability with others, but for one's own spiritual self and the material benefit that he derives from it. Elsewhere in his essay, de Koninck describes what interpersonal relations look like in societies where everyone loves the common good as his own particular good. It is completely within the line of humanism to see the first root, the most fundamental reason for the social character of man, not in the common good, but in the poetic nature of the individual, in the need for self-expression and self-communication, under pressure from an interior superabundance of pure self. Understand then that the person of the other is necessary because I feel the need to make myself heard, because I need someone to appreciate me, because I need a person, subject. In short, with respect to me, your reason to be is to participate in my personal life. That's a damning critique of this whole line of thought. However accurate de Koninck is in his reading of the personalists, he, I think, identifies something that we find in our own contemporary society. In short, with respect to me, your reason to be is to participate in my personal life. And that's why I love you. For de Koninck, the personalist conception of the primacy of the person proves disastrous for political theory because it identifies no principle for the ordering of human society other than the person himself. In other words, absent a common good which members of a family or a city love as their proper and better good, each individual would have no choice but to desire and engage the life of the family of the city in view of the next best good that he is bound in justice to love and preserve, the particular good of the self. The ruinous effect of the social aggrandizement of the particular good could not be clearer for de Koninck. As he describes above, to submit to the pursuit of the common good, to submit the pursuit of the common good to the pursuit of the particular good, instrumentalizes not only the good of the family and the good of the city to the flourishing of the self, it instrumentalizes also all of the members of these societies to the same flourishing of the self. Others exist in personalist society, de Koninck laments, so that they might participate in my personal life. That is not community. That is tyranny. The self becomes the common good to which all others are ordered. From the Thomistic point of view, the personalist instrumentalization of the common good to the particular good effectively removes the person from, by elevating him above, the communicatio established by the common good, in which and for which, according to Aquinas, persons for whom that common good is perfective interact with each other, cooperate with each other, and eventually love each other. A brief overview of Aquinas' doctrine of communicatio will confirm not only de Koninck's criticism of personalist doctrine, but also his declarations repeated at the beginning of this essay that others are lovable insofar as they can participate in the common good. And communication with the common good establishes the communication of individual persons among themselves. Thomist scholars in the 20th century paid significant attention to Aquinas' understanding of communicatio as the foundation of friendship. In a 1986 essay, Joseph Bobick, then an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Notre Dame, summarized their work. Bobick highlights, for example, the observations of Father Leo Bond, OP, who demonstrated that for Aquinas, similitudo between persons, similarity of both species and accidental qualities, does not suffice to found friendship. In addition to similitudo, Bond explained, friendship requires a certain communicatio, a certain being thrown in together in some social context. This is necessary to unite persons. This communicatio joining persons makes friendly conversatio between them possible. Bobick points also to Jerome Rausch's confirmation of Bond's interpretation of Aquinas' doctrine. More clearly than Bond, Rausch explains how for Aquinas, communicatio as the foundation of friendship bears not the notion of personal exchange, but rather the notion of community, or the exercise of community, within which the personal exchanges of friendly conversatio take place. In the same vein, Bobick features the scholarship of Father Josephus Keller, OP, who noted that in Aquinas' text, as in Aristotle's, communicatio possesses at times an active sense and at other times an intransitive sense. The active sense of communicatio denotes the personal exchanges, social interactions, and common pursuits that constitute the activities of friendship. By contrast, the intransitive sense of communicatio denotes not an active communication between friends, but rather something passive, a sharing, a having in common, which centers upon something common that is simply there, as something capable of being mutually apprehended, in order thereupon to be actually mutually apprehended, then mutually valued, and mutually loved. Bobick points to Keller's active intransitive distinction as particularly helpful for reading Aquinas' discussion of the kind of communicatio necessary to found friendship. Bobick writes, the context of Summa Theologiae, Secunda Secundae, question 23, article 1, makes it clear that the communicatio which functions as foundation of friendship is communicatio in the intransitive sense. In other words, the inactive communication or community of persons deriving from their sharing of some good in common. It is the common diffusion of the good as final cause that unites them. This is prerequisite to the active conversation among persons that is observed by all as the vital signs of friendship. A careful reading of question 23, article 1, confirms Bobick's interpretation of it. In this article, after Aquinas explains that the love of concupiscence, or the self-referential regard for the other, cannot produce friendship, he continues, but neither does well-wishing suffice to account for friendship. For a certain mutual love is required, since the friend is a friend to his friend. Now, such a mutual benevolence is founded on some communication, communicatio. For Aquinas, neither the self-referential love of concupiscence nor the one-sided love of benevolence suffices to establish friendship between persons. What is required is some active conversatio of mutual benevolence in which each wishes the other his good. Aquinas is quick to mention, however, that this active conversatio is not itself friendship's foundation. It is rather friendship's flourishing. The foundation on which the active conversatio of friendship rests is some other communication, or intransitive communicatio, which establishes the friends within the community of some good before they wish this good for each other. Based on his reading of Bond, Rausch, Keller, and of others, Bobic concludes that Aquinas employs the term communicatio throughout his corpus to identify three distinct realities pertaining to friendship. In each case where the term appears, context helps to determine which of the three realities Aquinas is discussing then and there. In the first instance, Aquinas employs the term communicatio to denote, according to Bobic, the social relational context which is the foundation out of which friendship arises. Bobic indicates that this is the communicatio that Aristotle speaks of in the Nicomachean Ethics, when he says every form of friendship involves association. The associations that Aristotle identifies are of two basic species: domestic, based on common blood or a common hearth, and civic, based on common political good. For Aristotle, the two species of association possible to man serve as the foundation of various possible species of friendship into which he may enter, namely the friendships between husband and wife, between parents and their children, between siblings, between extended relations, between fellow tribesmen, between fellow citizens, etc. Bobic identifies this first sense of communicatio, the foundation of friendship, as a passive rather than an active cause of friendship. Bobic calls it the enabling cause, or a condition within which the active cause can bring out its effect. Bobic does not mention it, but communicatio's passive causality here reveals this first kind of communicatio as a final cause of friendship. Aquinas' second manner of employing communicatio denotes, according to Bobic, the activities of friendship. This is the communicatio that Aristotle discusses elsewhere in the Nicomachean Ethics, namely where he mentions that friendship is a partnership, implying the living together of friends and of all the activities that naturally flow from it, namely drinking together, gambling together, hunting together, playing sports together, studying philosophy together, everything that happens here at Benedictine, just to name a few of the examples that Aristotle gives. The second kind of communicatio is the active cause of friendship that Bobic distinguishes from friendship's enabling cause. Although actively an initiating and perpetuating cause of friendship, Bobic says, the second communicatio remains in essence, compared to the first, the proper effect of friendship. Here, communicatio's active causality reveals this second kind of communicatio as an efficient cause of friendship. Finally, Aquinas' third manner of employing communicatio, which is signaled by his use of the active verb communicare, to communicate, denotes the offering of a gift, which provides a foundation where there was none, out of which friendship can arise. Bobic explains what this offering of a gift entails. Whenever two persons, he writes, a superior and an inferior, have nothing in common, but the superior offers a shareable gift to the inferior, not only do the two begin thereby to have something in common, communicatio in the first sense, which makes friendship between them possible, but it becomes fitting that the inferior respond to the initiative of the superior by doing whatever he can to help make actual the friendship to which he has been invited. For Aquinas, this communicatio of superior to inferior is precisely the kind of communicatio that God establishes with man in offering him the gift of beatitude. This offering by God establishes between God and man a kind of sharing, a sharing in final happiness, which establishes between them the kind of social context out of which friendship between God and man may develop. Aquinas writes, "Since God communicates his happiness to us, there arises some communicatio between man and God upon which some friendship should be founded. The love founded on this communicatio is charity." For Bobic, this third manner of employing communicatio is Aquinas' contribution to the Aristotelian discussion of friendship that Aquinas inherits. Whereas Aristotle rightly concluded that no communicatio naturally unites God and man, he's right. Given their ontological distance from each other, that's clear. Aquinas readily describes the communicatio supernaturally established by God in the Old and New Covenants. In summary of Aquinas' teaching, Bobic explains, though God and man are infinitely apart, infinitely unequal with respect to virtue and ability to delight and ability to be useful, they are nonetheless, or at least can be, members of the same social group. This is God's doing, his gracious gift to us. As members of the same social group, Aquinas teaches, God and man can become friends. The communicatio that God establishes with man enables man to conduct a conversatio with God. Bobic's survey of Aquinas' doctrine of communicatio both enlightens and is enlightened by Deconic's survey of Aquinas' doctrine of the common good. Bobic's survey enlightens our understanding of Deconic's assertion with which we opened this essay. Others are not the reason for the proper lovableness of the common good. Rather, under this formal relation, others are lovable insofar as they can participate in the common good. Though Deconic does not use the term, communicatio is the presumed reality upon which he builds his point. Deconic argues that the loving conversatio of family members is not the cause, but rather the effect of their lovable communicatio in the common good of the family. Accordingly, the friendship of family members roots itself not in some generous interior principle, as the personalists contend, but in the members' possession of one and the same common good, the good of the family, of which each member constitutes a part. Bobic helps us to identify the participation in the common good of which Deconic speaks as the communicatio that Aquinas highlights in his first manner of using the term. Conversely, Bobic's treatment of communicatio is enlightened by Deconic's treatment of the common good, particularly by the second of Deconic's quotations referenced in the introduction above. The communication with the common good establishes the communication of individual persons among themselves. Though Bobic does not specifically mention the common good in his descriptions of communicatio, Deconic helps us to see how Bobic constantly refers to it nonetheless. In Deconic's description of friendly relations among persons, he makes clear that the communication of individual persons upon which friendships are founded itself has a foundation. It rests on the communication of individual persons with the common good. The common good, the good of the person better than his particular good, insofar as it can be shared. And its very shareability establishes its beneficiaries in a social context wherein they may converse as friends about what they share. Thanks to their communication with the common good, individual persons communicate in a shared social context out of which can arise the conversation of friends. Thank you. Sure, please.
I'm not so familiar with the personalist positions on these issues, but I've got a couple of questions that might ask about a kind of litmus test.
Okay.
First off, I noticed the vocabulary of person and the vocabulary of individual. What about Boethius's definition of a person as an individual substance of a rational nature? How seriously do the participants in the discussion take that? And the second point, I think, has to bear on the notion of communicatio. I noticed that in Aristotle's Politics, the notion of koinonia, which would probably translate conveniently into communicatio, seems to be based upon the fact that human beings talk with each other.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder whether you would comment on either or both of those points.
Sure. So in regard to the first question, yeah, Deconic was not the first or the only one to raise his voice against what we're seeing as, from a classical point of view, troublesome parts of the kind of new ascendant personalist doctrine of dignity. Some thought the distinction between personal and individual certainly led to a certain Cartesian view of the human person. So you could see that, I think, even in some of the quotations we looked at here. Deconic himself, though, refers back to Boethius's definition and says that this suffices. And why? Well, because he says Boethius's definition is helpful because there's such a stress on the unity of the substance of the person. And even though he's constituted of two principal parts, spirit and matter, soul and body, what is so clear, or what's communicated so clearly in Boethius' definition is kind of the singular subsistence of person, constituted a body of soul, that suffices, that one doesn't need to, at least from Deconic's point of view, separate the two components of the human person into these kind of poles or centers of identity and activity, even if, and as we saw Maritain do, try to maintain the unity of the person. So so in some of the critics, echoes, if not direct reference to Boethius, comes up. Second, Bobek's article here is interesting. There are parts of it I left out. He does look at some of the vocabulary more closely, the Greek vocabulary of Aristotle, and shows how Aquinas' Latin can be linked to certain Greek terms in Aristotle. I forget all of the connections just off the top of my head, but that might be a place to look for this a little more. The Modern Schoolman, I think. I can look that up for you. What's interesting is, in terms of communication, communication is a wonderful thing. We talk to each other all the time. We talk to lots of people all the time. But what Aquinas is careful to see, that communication itself is not enough to establish friendship. It's not just the capacity to speak to each other that makes us friends, or even, in fact, actual communications. But there has to be something that binds us before we even begin to speak in friendly terms that makes the possibility of friendly relations possible. And for Aquinas, as for the ancients, that was a principle exterior to the person, the common good, because it's in the wide diffusion of the common good, whatever it is, of the family, of the city, of the cosmos, even God. We're already united in the comprehension of that good, the mutual love of that good, and that creates a social context within which then we begin to speak to each other as members of that good. And it's as members, in a sense, of that good. That's the very principle that makes friendship possible. So there has to be something shared between the friends before, in fact, they become friends, affectively, with each other. And that's from Deconic's point of view, what gets eclipsed when in a kind of new conception of human dignity, which is rightly seeking to fend off the threats of totalitarianism, the move to put the person above kind of the threatening state, well then actually, from Deconic's point of view, moves the person above the principle, which actually makes people friends with each other. So the correction is not to remove or help the person escape the city and the family, but rather to correct the totalitarian, to say that you misconceive the family and the city. And DeConnick has a whole explanation of what the totalitarian error regarding the common good is, that he thinks the personalists concede in their doctrine.
Thank you, Father. So I might be missing something here.
Okay.
You may have mentioned this already. What do you think St. Thomas or DeConnick's approach to somebody like a John Paul II would be, where they're going to talk about the person and personalism and dignity as important, but the importance is found within the individual communicatio, right? John Paul II writes this whole book on this when he's a bishop, in sort of a phenomenological sense. So what do you think St. Thomas's approach to something like that, where the personalism is found, where you try to do like a both and? Is he going to say that that's trying to have your cake and eat it too, or is he going to be more receptive to that?
Yeah. So I published a little work a couple years ago. What was the name of it? Was the Polish Pope a French personalist? Perspectives from, I think it was Novid Vetter is running a symposium of Evangelium Vitae, so I took some quotes from that. I think that Wojtyła stands out from this crowd. So the question is whether, let's say, somebody like Wojtyła's personalism would be subject to the same critique that DeConnick, I think, clearly offers to certain French personalist writers. I think Wojtyła does escape it for various reasons. One, Wojtyła is very careful in maintaining proper awareness of not only Boethius's definition of the person, but also Thomas's doctrine of the common good. And you see this repeated over and over again. There are certain essays that Wojtyła published before his election at Pope. One is called To Mystic Personalism. The other, is it Person and Community, something like that. The exact name escapes me. But he's dealing with this point. And he sets out as his goal, he wants to begin from the subjective kind of point of concern of the personalist, but arrive at kind of the objective reality that's articulated by the ancients and medievals. Can you bring those two together? That's his attempt. Whether he's successful or not, that's another question. But over and again, at key moments, he refers back to first principles and the proper orientation of the particular good to the common good. And he does that within the subjective conversation of 20th century personalists. So on the one hand, I think he's correcting maybe the excesses he sees on the one hand on the personalist side, but he's also trying to demonstrate to, let's say, the more objective side of the question that concern for the subjective is valid and need not itself be a distraction from objective truth. I think one of the most effective ways that Wojtyła does this is that he shows the personalists, on the one hand, how the I-thou conception of human relations, while true, is insufficient. He says because the I-thou itself has a further resolution in the we. And for Wojtyła, I think that's his name for the common good. I mean, it's the good of the we that constitutes the various I's, not just as I-thous, but into a we. That Wojtyła has a certain insight there. So again, within the personalist conversation, trying to expand it to consider and take account of what the ancients and the medievals do, so what was obvious to them about the social and political nature of the human person. Yeah.
Thank you, Father. I just wanted to ask you, because I don't really know too much about personalism.
Sure.
What are its roots? Because we have here like Emmanuel Mounier, like the founder of French personalism, but like what are like, would it be like Platonic, or like what's the
That's a good
the roots of that?
I would leave that to some of the philosophers in the room. I think the strand of personalism that DeConnick himself writes against is of a particular kind. It emerges from out of Europe in the 1920s and 30s for good reason. Totalitarian regimes are beginning to develop. They're already beginning to show the negative effects, and people are alarmed in France, in Italy, Germany, Spain. Places that we hear a lot about, in the news even this week. So, Poland, Ukraine, dealing with the threat of totalitarian oppression. The one thing that a lot of these totalitarian regimes are doing to justify their march towards totalitarianism or totalitarian oppression of their people is they're appealing to the common good. Falsely, but effectively. You can look at Hitler's speeches, you can look at Mussolini's speeches, they're peppered with reference to the common good. So these folks, looking for how do we defend individuals from state oppression? Well, the old way of referring to the common good, doesn't seem to be a likely path given the way it's been corrupted. And I think we still have the effects of that today. Even in the American context, talk of the common good is tinged, it can elicit a kind of fear that, fascism is just, around the corner. So they develop a way of talking about the dignity of the human person, or identifying something within the person that simply is not subject to the political power. That the human person has a transcendent quality in view of his spiritual personality that's not subject to material creation, and that would include the political authority, ordained even by God to arrange temporal affairs. So that's kind of the beginning of it, and then that's, develops into a kind of a whole new theory, an anthropology. So I think for some of these guys, they had the political end in view first, and then moved back towards a kind of anthropology that supported kind of the political end. But DeConnick and others see that this is a misstep. It's not the human person and his dignity who needs to be redefined, to protect against totalitarianism, because what they see is that when the personalists don't correct the incorrect view of the common good by the totalitarians, they're actually granting it. So by kind of removing the person from the totalitarian threat, which is to say, to remove the person from the threat that the common good, presents to the person, well, they're ceding to the totalitarian the bad conception of the common good, redefining the person against that. So then you're left, from DeConnick's point of view, with a bad conception of the common good and a bad conception of the human person. And therefore, the solution is to kind of return to first principles and say, no, what needs to be corrected here is the totalitarian view of the common good, and why it's false, and not cede to totalitarian regimes a misuse of even the concept. So that's, I think, where DeConnick is coming from.
Let's start with the philosopher and then go to the poet.
Yeah, I was wondering if, for the students in the room, maybe you could give just a straightforward definition of the common good.
Sure.
Because I think the way people's minds tend to go is that the common good is the sum of the individual goods.
Right.
And if you'd asked me, I would have said it was shared activity, but you're saying no, there's something else that's this communicatio that is prior to shared activity.
Right.
Yeah, so I think it might help some of the students,
Yeah.
and it would also help me differentiate what you're saying.
Right. Okay, briefly. No, this is hard. I mean, we're in the realm now of kind of metaphysics proper. I mean, a kind of real abstract discussion of the good and description of the good, which is not immediately tangible. We don't detect it with our senses, but we only glimpse it through proper kind of pondering, contemplation, reflection on the good itself. But if I can just quickly summarize what the ancients and medievals recognized that in terms of what is the good is that which all things desire insofar as they desire their perfection. For each nature, there are certain goods that are perfective of that nature, which means there are certain goods proper to that creature by reason of his nature. The human creature is the same. Has certain goods for us, which are perfective of our nature, actualize the potencies of our nature, and lead to our flourishing and happiness. They're intellectual, but also physical, material. I mean, we have kind of a high range. Within the category, though, of the proper good, those goods that are perfective of particular natures, individual natures, a distinction can be made between particular goods and common goods. So we have two kinds of proper goods, or two kinds of goods that are proper to particular natures. The particular good is that kind of good which, as an end, a good, a final cause that diffuses its goodness to its beneficiary, diffuses its goodness to only one beneficiary at a time. What's that? My lollipop is my lollipop. My habit is my habit. I can share it with somebody else. I can share the lollipop. I can share these things. But in essence, it belongs properly to one insofar as it diffuses its goodness towards the actualization of the potency of a given nature by being consumed. It's gone, usually, when it's finished. So it's the way in which it's flush with goodness is very weak insofar as it can only diffuse its goodness to the benefit of one. But those aren't the only kinds of goods that exist. There are others that are common, which is to say that they are so flush with goodness that they can diffuse their goodness to many beneficiaries at once without itself being divided or diminished. So there's a transcendent quality to these goods. By remaining singularly one, it's the proper good of many at once, diffusing its goodness and being the final good, or a final good or final end of many at once, without itself, like I said, being divided or diminished or losing its goodness. Now, in many ways in which we can identify different kinds of these, but in terms of the human good and human common goods, are properly speaking the social goods of the family, the good of the city, the good of the cosmos, and God as the separated and final good of all things. Which means these are goods that, exercising their goodness as final ends, and that's sometimes hard to see. They're not efficient causes, they're final causes. Common goods don't work on their beneficiaries by pushing them. Common goods work on their beneficiaries by pulling them, by attracting them, by drawing them to it. Such that the pursuit then of that good becomes the subject of common love, common effort, common activity. The family has to work together for the flourishing of the family. The city works together for the flourishing of the city. Cosmos is a little different. There's not much we do to affect that. God's in charge there more than we are. But that would be a way of beginning to understand. So really what common goods are, or at least be able to identify them, they're in distinction from particular goods, and it's a metaphysical principle. Both of those being goods proper to individual natures. It's tough, though, even the church in her own social teaching sometimes can offer kind of vague, slippery kind of mentions and also descriptions of the common good. And that's for various reasons, but I've just found it. But in the compendium of the social teaching of the church, there is a paragraph that's been inserted there, which is not quoted from anywhere else. It's original to the compendium, which makes this point about kind of the metaphysical quality, the properly understood metaphysical quality of common goods as being one, indivisible and indiminishable, while being the good of many at once. Yeah.
So, I'm aware of the distinction you just made. Examples that used to come to mind for me were knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
but also friendship.
Right.
But the title you're targeting for common good is principle.
Right.
So, is the friendship the common good that leads to an individual friendship?
Right.
In other words, what's the causality?
Right. That's a good question. And Aquinas touches this because he recognizes that common can be predicated of goods in different ways. Some things, he says, are in fact properly common in the way I've just described. He said other things we call common because they have the appearance of commonness. It is not incorrect to call them common, but he calls them, we predicate that, well, that's what he says, it's kind of common in predicando as opposed to common in causando. So I think that's a helpful distinction to see, that in terms of properly speaking, common goods are the ones that I've just described, but others, and Gregory, I can't ever remember how to pronounce his last name, teaches at TAC, Freilich. He's got good articles on this, talking about how the ways in which we can use the term common in terms of certain goods. But it's that we have to be careful in distinguishing, are we just predicating commonness here because it has that appearance, or is it as a final end, as a final cause, actually common? I would suggest that things like friendship, virtue, truth, health, those are predicated as common without being themselves properly common. Because you have to ask, well, what is the good there in terms of friendship? Like, where's the one thing that's being loved, that's diffusing its goodness to many at once? Well, that's not exactly friendship. You can see it more clearly in something like truth or health. Like health, or the health of a city, doesn't exist apart from the individual healthy states of the individual. So what you actually have is healthy individuals who, within a polis or within a family, we predicate health to the whole because of the actual health of the members. Whereas looking at common goods otherwise is different. Is that right? Are we in danger? Somebody said a storm was coming. Yeah. But that's his articles are really helpful on this if you've not seen them. Yeah.
Well, we do have a tornado warning
Okay.
in effect until 8:30, so I assume we should go downstairs to the basement this way. But we can quickly thank Father Aquinas again and continue the conversation.
Thank you all.